And, statistically, when it comes to cheating in a marriage, men are the bigger cheaters. In a survey, they found out that 20% of men have had an affair compared to women's 13%. But ladies, before you get so proud of yourselves, you should probably also know that women's affair rates have increased by 40% since 1990. And when it comes to emotional affairs, 77% of men say they've had an emotional affair compared to 90% of women who say they have had an emotional affair. Now, that number was really hard for me to believe. I thought 90% of women have had an emotional affair. But the problem is I just kept reading it over and over and over again, and we all know that the internet never lies, so we're going to go with it. But after I read that, I just, whether the statistic is true or not, I had to think about it. And I was like, you know what? Let me look up the definition of an emotional affair. What even is an emotional affair? Well, here's the definition. It's a bond between two people that mimics or matches the closeness and emotional intimacy of a romantic relationship while not being physically consummated. So I just thought, wow, that's wild to think about. And as I was researching all this cheating, I learned two other things that were interesting. First, I found out that 86% of people that choose to forgive in their marriage when it comes to cheating experienced emotional reconnection again after 12 months. And I also found out that 57% of divorces happen because one spouse or the other, or both, cheated. Now, when I look at that tells me, for one thing, forgiveness is possible. But I also realize that usually the pain is too great, and it usually ends up in divorce. But as I was doing this research, there was another statistic I found interesting. It says that when someone confesses to having an affair, 57% of those marriages were actually salvaged. But for someone who has never confessed, even if they got away with it, only 20% survived if they covered it up and got caught, or if they even never got found out. So here's the thing, church. No matter how you look at it, cheating is a horrible thing. There's a horrible cost that comes with cheating for you, for your spouse, for your kids. And when you think about the negatives of cheating, right, you have to wonder, why would someone ever do that? Why would you do that? There's another person who has dedicated themselves to you, likely someone who loves you and cares for you, probably someone who's been loyal to you, definitely someone who you swore before God that you would love and care for and take care of and be dedicated to. But what's really wild about cheating statistics to me is that I also found out that 2/3 of people who cheat don't regret it. They wouldn't even change it if they could. Now, church, why am I starting off with that this morning? Is it so you married folks can have uncomfortable conversations at lunch today? Is that my goal? No. The reason I'm bringing that up to start off this morning is because God uses the image of an earthly marriage to illustrate his relationship between Christ and the church. Right? The book of Ephesians tells us that our marriage is meant to look like the relationship between Christ and his church. We live out that illustration to the world around us. However, that's put in the Bible far after God used marriage to illustrate another relationship between him and someone. God actually uses the image of adultery as the image of how Israel was treating him. That he had made a dedication and that Israel decided to play the harlot. Okay? So he asked a guy named Hosea to bring that message to Israel in a very physical way, okay? And we're going to talk about that today. Now, before we do that, I want to recap just in case you haven't been here or you forgot and you just need to be caught up. I have the timeline that I have edited, and so the font is nice and big so you can actually see it this week. You're welcome. So here's where we are, right? We know that Israel started under the leadership of Moses. Moses was both a prophet and a judge. So he was their political leader and their spiritual leader, okay? And from there on, the judges came and they led Israel the same way until we get to Samuel. Now with Samuel, leadership, the situation split, right? So the political leadership went to the kings while prophets kept their spiritual leadership. And from there, we've been looking at prophets. So they were under 3 kings, Saul, David, and Solomon, before the kingdom actually split in 2. A lot of people don't realize that you had Israel, and Israel split into Israel in the north and Judah in the south, 2 completely different kingdoms from each other, okay? And after that point, last week we were actually looking at Isaiah, who's down here in the southern kingdom, okay? Well, today we're going to flash back up to the northern kingdom. And we're going to be looking at Hosea. You can see him right there at the end, right before we get to exile to Assyria, okay? And that's when actually Israel ceases to ever be a nation again, all right? So that's kind of where we're at in the story. Now we're going to start here in Hosea chapter 1, verse 1, and we're going to see how Hosea is called to teach Israel to change from what they've been doing, okay? Starting here in verse 1, it says, "The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah in the south. And in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel in the north," okay? So he's giving two different lists of kings here, one from the south and one from the north. Now, Hosea's name actually means salvation. It sounds really similar to a word you might recognize, Hosanna, right? It's a word that we often sing, Hosanna. Now, Hosanna actually means save us, we pray. This is what they shouted when Jesus came into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and they were shouting, Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest. They were shouting, save us, we pray. Well, if you just look at the root of that, you get Hosea, which means salvation. That is his name, okay? Now, we don't know a whole lot about Hosea as an individual person, okay? What we do know is that his dad's name was Beeri, which means well digger, okay? So he probably dug ditches for a living, all right? And that's the majority of what we know about him. We also know he's familiar with the northern kingdom, so he was probably from Israel versus Judah. But that's interesting because if he was working in the north, why is it when he gives a timeline that he refers mostly to the southern kings? Right? He gives his dates using just kings from Judah. And using those kings as a timeline, if you look at the span of those southern kings, it goes about 87 years worth of kingship that he served under. However, it's not likely that he served all 87 years. All right, he probably came in toward the end of Uzziah's reign and toward the beginning of Hezekiah's reign, which means that he probably actually worked for 50 years or so as a prophet. All right. Now, one thing we don't see in Hosea's story is, remember in that timeline at the end, Assyria comes in and invades Israel and scatters them. Okay. We don't see that mentioned in the book of Hosea. We see it predicted, but we don't see it happen, which means Hosea probably died before that actually took place. Okay. So here's what we need to know. Hosea does most of his work with King Jeroboam in the north. So I think he used the southern kings to say, hey, here's the timeline, but when we get back to the north, I only want to focus on Jeroboam because that's where the majority of my ministry was focused, on King Jeroboam in the north. All right? So at this time, under King Jeroboam, the kingdom was prospering like crazy. Okay, the northern kingdom, on the surface, everything seemed great. However, the more comfortable they got, the further away from God they also got, which honestly sounds a lot like us today, right? The more comfortable we are, the less we think we need God, so we don't turn to him. So Hosea's goal is to call Israel back to God, to refocus on what they had forgotten, okay? So let's look at verse 2. It says, when the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, and for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord, okay? So God literally says, hey, Hosea, go marry a prostitute. And I want you to marry a prostitute as a symbol of what Israel is doing to me. So Hosea is going to live out this illustration, right? And his wife Gomer, the prostitute, is going to represent Israel, and Hosea is going to represent God. And as Gomer is continually cheating, that becomes the illustration of the way Israel is responding to God, constantly cheating on God. But today it's interesting because we are meant to live out our marriages in a different way. God tells Christians to live out their marriages as a symbol of Christ in the church. And it's important that we remember that. So here's your first fill in the blank if you grab your Connect cards this morning. Our marriages are meant to represent our God. Okay? One way or another, our marriages are meant to represent our God. And we often think of our spouse as someone that we can treat differently. Think about the way you treat your spouse. We feel like we can say harsh things to them we wouldn't say to other people. We feel like we can be more critical of them than we are of other people. We blame them for our own unhappiness, right? But the truth is our relationship to them is one of the most important that we have, and we should cherish it and care for it. So now the fact that Hosea is told to marry a prostitute, okay, this might give us one more clue about who Hosea actually was. Okay, there's a good chance that he wasn't a Levitical priest. A lot of these prophets were Levitical priests that became God's prophets, but it seems like Hosea probably wasn't, okay, because Levitical priests were not allowed to marry adulterers. It was a disqualifying factor, and God wouldn't tell somebody to violate the law, okay? So he was probably just a regular old ditch digger that God called into this ministry, all right? Now, the first 3 chapters in the book of Hosea are all the chapters that talk about what happened in Hosea's life, okay, about how his life models the exact conditions of Israel. But then from chapter 4 to the end, it's all about the message that he's then going to carry. Okay, so the first 3 chapters are his life. Everything else talks about, the message that God has for the people. All right, and we're going to be mostly focusing on that first chunk today. And that's because his marriage is a graphic example of how messed up Israel is and how they continually commit infidelity against God. And God says, Hosea, I want you to live this out for everyone so that they can see a reflection of themselves. I want them to see themselves in you, is what God is saying. So now we need to understand that everything we see in these first 3 chapters of Israel is seeing that. It's not just Hosea and his wife Gomer and the way she treats him, but this is how Israel is treating God. Okay, so let's hop over to Hosea chapter 2, verse 6, and we'll kind of get an example of what Gomer is going to do. It says, therefore I will hedge up her way with thorns, and I will build a wall against her, so that she cannot find her paths. She shall pursue her lovers, but not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for it was better for me then than now. So Gomer, she's out there living a life amongst all these different lovers, right, going from man to man. And in fact, we're going to see later on that she was probably a temple prostitute working for the temple of Baal, okay? But she's participating in this prostitution that just never gets better. And when we think of prostitute, we think of somebody going, I don't want to do this, but I just do it because it's the easiest way to make money, right? That doesn't seem to be her situation. She's not just trying to make a living. It's like, I can't get enough of these other men, so I may as well get paid to do it, right? That's basically the way she's living her life. And when she gets married to Hosea, she doesn't even take a break from prostitution. It's like, I'm just going to keep right on doing what I've been doing. And so we read this passage about this idea of hedging things in, which means that God is saying, you're never going to get satisfaction. Gomer is sleeping with man after man after man and getting no satisfaction out of this, okay? So she keeps on chasing it and chasing it and chasing it for years, but she never gets what she wants. She keeps putting herself in situations of using and being abused and having all these terrible costs, but it's not fulfilling the thing that's missing inside of her. And one day she's going to wake up and go, oh, things really were better back at home with my husband. I'm going to go back. But even though God says that's what's going to happen, it's not going to last because she's going to go right back out to doing what she was doing, okay? This is exactly what's happening with Israel at the time. That God keeps wanting them to come back to him, but Israel keeps going and doing their own thing. And even when they want to come back, it's never permanent. You know, when Moses first led Israel out of Egypt, they made a deal with God, almost like a marriage. In Exodus 6:7, it says, I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. So God promises we're going to have this good and special relationship. It's going to be just me and you. But Israel wants a bunch of substitutes. They don't just want God. They go after other gods like Marduk and Baal. And they make alliances with other nations like Egypt and Assyria instead of coming under God's power. They try to replace God with everything around them, but they're never satisfied. And every once in a while, just like Gomer, Israel has a wake-up call and they run back to God because of some attack or some threat or some catastrophe, and they get it for a minute and they go back to God and it's like, yay, everything's right again, but it never lasts long because before you know it, they go right back to doing what they were doing before. And so Hosea's marriage is a perfect image of what Israel is doing to God. Matter of fact, even his kids become a part of this. Remember back in Hosea chapter 1, verse 2, it said, go take yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom. In other words, the kids Hosea is going to be raising are not his kids. Maybe a couple are, maybe a couple are not, but the odds are most of these kids are from all these other men that Gomer is sleeping with, and yet Hosea chooses to be their father and raise them and love them anyway. All right, so let's look at Hosea chapter 1, verse 3. It says, so he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. Okay, so what just happened there? Right? Well, first, you know, we don't really know a whole lot about Hosea's wife, Gomer. We know her name is Gomer. We know her dad's name was Diblaim. And we know that she's a working woman. That's about it. That's about all we know, okay? And then she has this son for Hosea, and God says to name him Jezreel. Now, what is Jezreel? Well, Jezreel is actually the name of a place, okay? And the name Jezreel means literally, God will scatter. okay? This is symbolic of what God's about to do to Israel. For one thing, God is going to scatter them. Remember, we've been talking about this for weeks, that Assyria is going to come into Israel, take them into captivity, scatter them, and they won't be a nation anymore. Okay, so that's what Assyria is going to do. And it's really God that's doing it, okay? And then after that, God takes Assyria on down to Judah and then flips it over for Babylon, and he takes care of Judah down there too. But for Hosea, what he's revealing is about 30 years or so after Hosea's ministry, Israel is going to be gone. That northern kingdom won't exist anymore. And those 10 tribes are going to be scattered just the same way that Hosea's son's name is Jezreel. God scatters. And this scattering is going to take place in a location called the Valley of Jezreel, the place where God scatters, okay? And this is going to be done to punish the house of Jehu. Now that name Jehu might sound familiar to you because we talked about him during the messages about Elijah and Elisha. Okay, Ahab was an evil king. He had an even eviler, if that's the word, wife named Jezebel. And they brought in all this Baal worship and persecuted the prophets of God and had all these problems. And so God committed Jehu to take out Ahab, to stop his kingly line, which Jehu did. But then why would God punish Jehu for doing what he told him to do? Well, here's the problem. Jezreel went and did this, Jehu went and did this in 2 Kings 10:11. So Jehu struck down all who remained in the house of Ahab in Jezreel, all his great men and his close friends and his priests, until he left him none remaining. Okay, God never told him to do all that. God said, take out the king in his line, which means his sons. He didn't say anything about all of his friends and the rest of his family and all the guys that worked for him, right? Jehu just did that on his own. He just went out and had this murdering spree, killing all these people that God never told him to do. Okay? So here's your next fill in the blank, church. Serve God humbly. That was Jehu's problem. He was not humble. He was overzealous. And honestly, I see that sometimes in the church where it's like, we want to serve God, and so then we take it so far that we're actually mistreating people, and it's like, okay, you're no longer serving God anymore. This is about you now. That's what Jehu was doing, and that's why Jehu is going to be punished, and his kingly line is going to be ended in Jezreel. Okay? So what happens next is we have to realize that this kid's name is bad news for Israel, right? This kid Jezreel, God's like, yeah, bad stuff's going to happen in Jezreel and you won't be a nation anymore. Kind of a big deal. And so Jeroboam's son, Zechariah, after him, is only going to reign about 6 months before he's assassinated. Jehu's line is done. A little bit after that, Israel is wiped out in the land of Jezreel. And then they're not a nation anymore. Okay? Just 30 years after this. So this kid has a rough life. All right, can you imagine being this kid where your name is a reminder that the king is going to be ended because of everything that went wrong and your nation's going to be overthrown? That's the way he had to live his life. That's what his name meant. He had to live his dad's harsh message to Israel that everyone was going to be facing some hard times. But that's how God is choosing to reach out to Israel. Like, hey, look at this prophet and look at his kids' names. Think about this, guys. That's what God is saying. But then there's a second kid who gets another name. All right, Hosea 1:6. She conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord said to him, call her name No Mercy, for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow or by sword or by war or by horses or by horsemen. Okay, so her name actually in the Hebrew is Lo Ruhamah, which means no mercy or no compassion or I don't care. That's what God says. Hey, name your daughter, I don't care. How about that? Let Israel know, I don't care. That's rough. This is for Israel, right? God is saying to Israel, because of what you've done, I don't care anymore. For you, my mercy is ending and my judgment is starting, so you're all on your own. I have no pity for you anymore. No mercy, I don't care. Now remember, I said that Israel was in a time of prosperity at this time. And the reason they were prospering is because Jeroboam was this great warrior king. He knew how to amass an army. He knew how to execute an attack. He knew how to inspire his men to fight. You might remember a couple weeks ago I said that the Bible refers to 4 guys in the Bible as mighty men of valor. Gideon, King David, Naaman, who was from Elisha's story, and then this guy Jeroboam. Jeroboam was a mighty man of valor, and his military victories gave Israel confidence and safety and lots of stuff. And everything the northern kingdom had was because of Jeroboam's military success. He was able to take it all by force. So Israel's not worried. They're not really afraid. Now they see Assyria coming, and it seems like it might be a bad thing, but it's still 30 years out, right? And the crazy thing is, when Israel's army finally heads out to Jezreel to meet up with the Assyrian army and to fight, it's like they're powerless, like they've been struck with kryptonite. So here's what you need to know, church, your next fill in the blank. Be careful where you place your trust. Be careful where you place your trust. Anybody in here ever have one of those dreams where you're like fighting someone and you're like about to punch them and your arm is just like, and you like can't swing? Anybody? Anybody have those dreams? A couple of us? And it's like you're fighting in mud, you just can't hurt them. That's basically what ends up happening to Israel. They go out to fight Assyria and it's like nothing they do helps. It's like one of those horrible dreams. And so Assyria sweeps right in, takes out Israel, and heads on down to Judah. But God says, but when they get to Jerusalem and Judah, I'm going to stop them. And he says, I'm not going to use bows, I'm not going to use swords, I'm not going to use horses. All those things you put your hope into for your strength, I don't need them. God says, I'm going to handle it myself. And just like I said last week, he does handle them. He takes out 185,000 Assyrians overnight by himself without using a single chariot. But that's what he does for Judah. Back in Israel, Israel has to face the music. So we have Lo Ruhamah, which is a reminder to Israel. I would have loved you, but now I don't have any pity on you. I just don't care. I will let you get what you want, which is a life without me. That's what God is saying. But then there's this third kid. And this third kid comes along, and as you can probably imagine, this kid doesn't have a real nice name either. All right, Hosea 1:8. When she had weaned no mercy, she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said, call his name, not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. So the son's name in Hebrew is actually Lo Ami. It literally means, not my family. You are not my family anymore. And what's interesting is when they translated this into the Greek, what they actually call this kid's name is, I am not, I am to you anymore. Now, that might sound like a weird name if you don't know the Hebrew and Yahweh and all that kind of stuff. But God's name is I am. And he says, I am not, I am to you anymore. If we go back to when Moses was first speaking to Pharaoh to speak on God's behalf, Moses said, who do I tell them who sent me? And God says, you tell them I am sent you. Right? This name implies everlasting God. I am what I am, the God who was and is to come, the self-existing, ever-present, unchanging God. I am what I am. And now God is saying, I am not, I am to you anymore. You're on your own. The first name I ever gave you to identify me, it's taken away. You are not my people, you are not my family, and you are not my children anymore. Now this kid's name is harsh, right? Who would want to have a name like that? Because they're not God's people. But what's interesting is we think of this and go, man, but God, why would you do that? That's mean, God. But you're thinking of this all wrong if that's what you're thinking. Because the reason God is saying, I am not your God, isn't because he's choosing this. He's just saying what they've already chosen. I'm not your God because you chose to make me not your God. That's why I'm not your God. This isn't me being mean or me punishing you. I'm just calling you out for what you chose. That's all it is. Right? They're supposed to turn to God for provision, for success, for worship, but they go everywhere else instead. So this name isn't God changing something. He's just calling out what Israel's already been doing. I'm not your God because you won't let me be. So here's what we need to know, church. Next fill in the blank. To belong to God is our choice. We get to choose to follow him or to not. And these poor kids have to live out a reminder to their nation by being named this. Imagine what that would be like today. If somebody was called out to be a prophet and your kids had to be named something, right? Imagine you go to Kroger, you see this dad pushing a cart, he's got 3 kids with him, right? And you're like, oh, those kids are cute. And it's like, oh, kids, it's so nice that you guys went to Kroger with your dad. What are your names? And the first kid says, my name is go to hell. And the second kid, my name is nobody cares about you. And the third kid, my name is God has abandoned you. And we're all here with daddy because mommy's a prostitute. How would you respond to that, right? Like, man, that family's having a rough day, right? Think about it. But here's the question. How often do we acts just like Israel was. Right? We think that Israel is so far removed from us. That's ancient. That's in the Bible. It's a made-up fairy tale. It's ridiculous. Nobody lives like that anymore. But look at us. Think about it. Look at our nation. Look at our church sometimes. Not us individually, because we're wonderful. But, but look at the church, right? The American church. Ask some questions about how we address the sexuality of people, or how we handle pregnancies, or our bodies, or our spouses, or the way that we treat the poor, or the way that we treat our children, or the way that we treat other races. Ask those questions and say, are we really that different from Israel? Do we really put God where he should be, and we obey him, and we respond to all those things the way he tells us to? Do we do that? Or do we do our own thing, which is exactly what Israel was doing? Are we any different? So when we look at the marriage of Hosea and Gomer, this is not a good marriage. This is a man who loves his wife and treats her well and is begging for her to come home. And that is exactly what Israel is doing. And for some of us, we might be doing that exact same thing even today in this room. You know, as the church, the Bible tells us that we are the bride of Christ. And we have to think, you know, are we living in a way to where we're honoring our husband? Are we honoring Christ as his bride? Is that how we live? Or do we live more like Gomer? Do we spend our time seeking after otherworldly pleasures because we want those more, because we think they're a good substitute for God? Going after the god of money, or the god of sex, or the god of power. Okay, church, but now we're going to look at one more thing, because so far this sermon is like a bummer, right? Like, man, this is really what was going on? I mean, these kids have horrible names, and this is a horrible marriage, and Israel is horrible. Well, watch what happens here in Hosea chapter 1, verse 10. It says, "Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' it shall be said to them, 'Children of the living God.'" Now that's crazy, because God has been saying a bunch of really bad stuff about Israel, right? And then all of a sudden, God makes a promise, or more precisely, he refers to a really old promise. He talks about this idea of the children of Israel being like the sand of the sea. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Have we ever heard that before? When we did our series on the life of Abraham, we read this passage in Genesis 22:17. "I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies." At this point, God goes all the way back to Abraham to recall the first promise that he ever made to the first person of the people of Israel, Abraham. God says, "By the way, I haven't forgotten my promise. I haven't changed my mind. I'm just not done yet." That's what God basically does in Hosea all these years later. Don't forget, I'm still working, guys. That's what God is saying. God says someday in the very place where we would say you are not God's people, in that very place they will say these are the children of the living God. Something will turn around. Something will change in the future, is what Hosea is saying, which is quite a change and should be comforting to us. So here's your last fill in the blank, church. Ultimately, everything will be made right. Thank God for that. So in that location where it says that they weren't God's people, which is where? In Jezreel, right? Jezreel is the location where they're going to say Israel isn't God's people anymore, because that's where they're defeated. Well, where is Jezreel today? What does that look like? Well, it's in a land that today is called Israel. Okay? Now, here's something weird. Jezreel. If Jezreel is there another name for Jezreel? Oh, you betcha. There's another name for Jezreel, one you might have heard before. Today it's called the Valley of Megiddo, or maybe you would recognize the Hebrew version. It's called Armageddon. Now, I know we're all having visions of Bruce Willis and Aerosmith and stuff when we think of Armageddon. Okay? The movie, anybody? No? Okay. Just me. So in this place, Armageddon, this is the exact same place that is also called Jezreel. This is in the future, this is the very place where Jesus comes down and takes over as king. So this word is saying in Hosea, hey, someday something's going to happen here to change everything around. And when we read the book of Revelation, we can see where that is and when it's going to happen. It's like, oh, God's actually going to fulfill his promise in the future in the book of Revelation. And what's interesting, and I love this because only God could do something like this, is in that very location, If you read about this in Revelation chapter 19, right before it, here is what the Bible says, Revelation 19:6. Then I heard what seemed to be the voice of a great multitude, like the roar of many waters, like the sound of mighty peals of thunder, crying out, Hallelujah, for the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and exult and give him the glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. And his bride has made herself ready. It was granted her to clothe herself with fine linen, bright and pure, for the fine linen is the righteous deeds of the saints. Now, I don't know if you're putting this together, but in that very place where Israel was declared to be a whore that left her God to pursue her own lusts, in that very same place, that is where Jesus is going to return and establish his reign with his new purified bride. It's incredible to me that Hosea will talk about this filthy bride, but someday there will be a clean bride in this same place. A bride that has been washed clean and made pure, no longer the adulteress that God's people were, but pure because of the love of Christ. Do you see, church, as dirty and filthy as we may be, Jesus makes all things new. He makes us bright and pure, even God's people. And God's Israel, who most of them will have accepted Christ at this point, alongside Gentiles like most of us, who are grafted into Israel, we get to be restored to the beautiful bride we were meant to be in the first place. To me, that's insane. It's gorgeous to think that God wrote that story, right? I'm going to have this people, they're going to act like a whore, they're going to go after all these other gods, but I'm going to make a new way, and there will be a purified bride, and everything is going to be made new in this exact same place, thousands and thousands of years apart. Church, only God can write something that cool. I mean, to me, that's like the most gorgeous story I've ever heard in my life. And so what I want to do, church, is close with this incredible passage, because God talks about this in Hosea 2:19. All the way back, he talks about what this is going to look like. Hosea 2:19. And I will betroth you to me forever. I will betroth you to me in righteousness and in justice, in steadfast love and in mercy. I will betroth you to me in faithfulness, and you shall know the Lord. And in that day I will answer, declares the Lord. I will answer the heavens, and they shall answer the earth. And the earth shall answer the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they shall answer Jezreel. And I will sow her for myself in the land, and I will have mercy on no mercy. And I will say to not my people, you are my people. And he shall say, you are my God. God even returns to the names of these kids. Jezreel, the place where you were declared to be a whore, I will return with a purified bride, the church. No mercy? I'm going to have incredible mercy on you. Not my people? You are my people, and I am your God. Everything will be made pure. I will be, I am to you once again. In church, we know today that that was accomplished by Christ. That Christ came to make this promise happen. And we're waiting for the complete fulfillment of it at the end of days. But church, we have hope today because Jesus chose to go to the cross for us, to make us pure, that we might have a chance to be his bride. Amen. And that's the beautiful thing about the story of Hosea. We see where we came from, but we also get to see who we're going to be.